My name is Daphne. I'm 28, and my parents are suing me because they think I'm just a broke waitress. They have no idea I'm secretly worth $42 million. The smell of burnt coffee and industrial-grade floor cleaner is a scent that sticks to your skin like a second layer of clothing. By 2 p.m., my blonde hair was pulled back in a fraying ponytail, a few stubborn strands plastered to my forehead by the steam of the dishwasher. My apron, once a crisp white, was now a map of the day's casualties. A ketchup smudge here, a dried gravy splotch there. "Daphne, table 4 needs a refill on the decaf," Joe, the cook, barked from the window. "On it," I called back, my voice sounding more tired than I felt. I grabbed the pot, the glass handle warm against my palm. I liked the diner. I liked the rhythmic clack-clack of the ceiling fan and the way the regulars, like Old Man Miller, would tell me about their grandkids for the third time in a week. Here, I wasn't a legacy or a disappointment. I was just Daphne, the girl who knew exactly how much cream you liked in your coffee. Then the door chimed. It wasn't the usual light melodic ring. It felt heavy. The entire diner seemed to go quiet as Charles Caldwell stepped inside. He looked like a localized glacier in a 3-piece charcoal suit. He didn't walk, he glided, his nose slightly upturned as if the very air in Penny's plate was personally offending him. Behind him, my mother, Victoria, hovered like a nervous bird, clutching a designer handbag that cost more than Joe's car. I didn't stop pouring the coffee. I kept my hand steady, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "Charles," my father said, stopping at the end of the counter. He didn't look at me. He looked at the mustard bottle next to my hand with profound disgust. "Charles, Victoria," I acknowledged, setting the pot down. "You're a long way from the country club. Want a menu? The liver and onions is the special." Victoria winced. "Daphne, darling, look at you. You have grease under your fingernails. This performance has gone on long enough." "It's not a performance," I said, wiping my hands on my apron. "It's a job, something you might recognize if you ever did one." My father's jaw tightened. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He didn't hand it to me, he tossed it onto the counter. It landed in a puddle of soda. Nana Rose was a fool in her final days, leaving $15 million to a girl who spends her days serving hash browns to truckers. It's a joke, and the court is going to see it that way. I looked at the envelope. Summons for a competency hearing. "We've filed for conservatorship, Daphne. You're clearly having some sort of breakdown. A girl of your pedigree living in a studio apartment and working for tips? It shows a complete lack of mental and financial stability. We're going to manage that money for you, for your own good." "For your own good?" I laughed, a dry, sharp sound. "You mean for your own mortgage. I know the Caldwell accounts are bone dry, Dad. I know you're drowning." Charles leaned in, his eyes cold. "Whatever delusions you have don't matter. Look at yourself, Daphne. You're a waitress. You're nothing. Next Tuesday, a judge is going to agree that you aren't fit to manage a piggy bank, let alone a fortune." He turned on his heel and walked out. The chime of the door felt like a gavel hitting a block. I stood there staring at the soda-soaked envelope. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was the thrill of the fight. They thought they knew me. They thought my bank account started and ended with the crumpled fives in my pocket. They were so wrong. My studio apartment was located 3 floors above a laundromat and shook every time the 402 bus rumbled past. It smelled like dryer sheets and cheap espresso, but to me, it smelled like freedom. After the shift from hell, I didn't collapse onto my thrift store sofa.
Instead, I kicked off my non-slip shoes and headed straight for the command center, a sleek, liquid-cooled laptop sitting on a desk I'd built out of reclaimed plywood. It was the only item I owned that cost more than $50, and it was worth more than my parents' entire fleet of leased Mercedes. I cracked my knuckles, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. I didn't open social media or a banking app. I opened a terminal window. Lines of green code began to dance across the black background. People think waitressing is just carrying plates. It isn't. It's high-stakes data management. You have to track 18 tables, remember who's allergic to peanuts, anticipate when a glass is 2 sips away from empty, and calculate mental totals in real time. I had taken that mental processing power and turned it into an algorithm. 6 years ago, I'd started with $50 in tips. I'd written a script that scanned emerging tech patents and predicted market shifts before the sharks on Wall Street even had their first scotch. I called it DC Ventures. The DC stood for Daphne Caldwell, but in the tech world, they thought it stood for Digital Capital. Nobody knew the CEO was currently scrubbing dried egg yolk off a laminate table in Philadelphia. I logged into my primary brokerage account. The numbers were staggering, even to me. $42,108,312.14. I stared at the balance. My parents wanted to prove I was unfit because I chose to live small. They thought poverty was a disease you caught from being lazy. They didn't realize that living on the bottom had given me the clearest view of how the world actually worked. A knock at the door made me jump. I quickly dimmed the monitors. I opened the door to find a man who looked like he'd been folded into a suitcase and sat on. His suit was a shade of brown that hadn't been popular since 1974, and he was carrying a briefcase held together by duct tape. "Daphne Caldwell?" he asked, adjusting thick-rimmed glasses. "Marcus?" "Marcus Thorne," he said with a small, tired smile. "I got your message and the, retainer." Marcus was a forensic accountant turned lawyer who specialized in unwinding the complicated lies of the ultra-wealthy. He was the most unassuming man in the legal world, which made him a lethal weapon. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Did you look at the summons?" He sat on my mismatched chair and pulled out the cream-colored envelope my father had dropped. "Your parents are swinging for the fences, Daphne. They aren't just asking for the trust. They're asking for a total freeze on your assets and a court-appointed guardian. They want to strip you of your legal right to sign a lease, buy a car, or even vote." I felt a chill run down my spine. They're that desperate for Nana Rose's money? "They're more than desperate," Marcus said, tapping his pen against his chin. "I did some preliminary digging. The Caldwell estate is a house of cards. They've leveraged the house home, the art collection, everything. They need that $15 million just to stop the banks from seizing the front door." I leaned back against my desk, the warmth of the hidden monitors pressing against my spine. They think I'm a helpless waitress they can bully into submission. They have no idea what's in this room, do they? Marcus looked at my dimmed monitors, then back at me. "If we reveal your true net worth now, they'll just pivot. They'll claim you've been manic or obsessive with money. No, we play their game. We let them think they're winning. We let them tell the world exactly how poor and unfit you are." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp behind the thick lenses. "We wait for the courtroom. We wait until they've lied under oath, and then we pull the rug. I want them to feel every bit of the humiliation they've tried to heap on me," I whispered. "Oh, I think we can manage that."
The first blow didn't come in a courtroom. It came on the front page of the Philadelphia Social Gazette. I was wiping down a greasy booth at the diner when I saw it. A customer had left a copy behind. There, sandwiched between an ad for a diamond gala and a charity polo match, was a photo of me. I was carrying a heavy bag of laundry toward the laundromat, my hair messy, my eyes tired. The headline screamed, "From Caldwell Couture to coin-op clothes, the tragic descent of a society daughter." The article wasn't just a story, it was a hit piece. It described me as disoriented, living in squalor, and rejecting reality. It quoted an anonymous family friend who sounded exactly like my mother, saying that I had been unraveling for years and that my refusal to accept the family's help was a sign of a deep psychological break. "Hey, Daphne?" Joe called from the kitchen, his voice softer than usual. "You okay? Some guy in a suit was outside taking pictures of the dumpster earlier. I chased him off with a spatula, but I think he got what he wanted." "I'm fine, Joe," I lied, my throat tight. I wasn't fine. I felt exposed. My quiet life, the one I had built brick by brick away from the Caldwell shadow, was being dragged through the mud to prove a point. They wanted the world to see a broke waitress so they could justify taking my inheritance. The bell chimed. I didn't even have to look up to know it wasn't a hungry trucker. The scent of expensive cologne, the kind that costs $500 a bottle and smells like cold silver, preceded him. Preston Vane, my parents' attorney, looked like he had been grown in a lab specifically to sue people. His hair was perfectly slicked back, and his teeth were a shade of white that didn't exist in nature. "Miss Caldwell," he said, pulling out a chair at the counter. He didn't sit, he just rested his manicured hand on the edge. "I trust you've seen the morning news. It's a shame, really, such a public spectacle for such a modest girl." "What do you want, Preston?" I asked, refusing to stop my work. I scrubbed a stubborn syrup stain with more force than necessary. "I'm here with an olive branch," he said, his voice smooth and oily. "Your parents are heartbroken. They don't want to humiliate you in court next week. If you sign this voluntary conservatorship agreement, we can keep the rest of this out of the papers. You'll get a generous monthly allowance, a nice apartment in a safe neighborhood, and you can leave this grease trap behind." He slid a document across the counter. I looked at the signature line. It didn't just give them the trust, it gave them total control over my life. "A generous allowance?" I asked, looking him in the eye. "And how much of Nana's $15 million would be left after Charles and Victoria get their management fees?" Preston's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned icy. "Your father is a pillar of this community, Daphne. You're a girl who counts nickels for a living. Who do you think the judge is going to believe? The man who sits on the board of 3 banks or the waitress who lives above a laundromat?" He leaned in closer, dropping his voice. "We have photos of your apartment, Daphne. We have your bank statements showing a balance of less than $400 in your checking account. We have witnesses who say you talk to yourself while you work. We will break you on that stand." "Is that a threat?" I asked. "It's a forecast. Sign the paper, Daphne. Go back to being a quiet little waitress, and we'll let you keep your dignity. Fight us, and we'll make sure you're remembered as the crazy Caldwell for the rest of your life." I picked up the document. For a second, his eyes lit up with triumph. Then, slowly and deliberately, I ripped it in half, then in quarters. I dropped the pieces into his lap. "The liver and onions is the special today, Preston." I leaned over the counter until we were inches apart. "But I think you've had enough of a mouthful. Get out." His face flushed a deep, angry red. He stood up, brushing the paper scraps off his suit as if they were toxic. "Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. Don't be late. I'd hate for the judge to issue a warrant for your arrest on top of everything else." As he walked out, the diner felt colder. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in the gray dishwater of a long shift. To anyone watching, I looked defeated. But beneath the counter, my phone buzzed with a notification from my trading app. DC Ventures. Quarterly gains up 12%. Current valuation, $43.2 million. The forecast was definitely changing. The rain in Philadelphia doesn't wash things clean. It just turns everything into a gray, slick version of itself. I sat in the back of the diner on a milk crate, taking my 10-minute break. The brick wall was cold through my thin uniform, and the alleyway smelled of wet cardboard and old grease. I checked my phone. My mother had left 3 voicemails in the last hour. I didn't listen to them. I knew the script, a mix of sobbing about family honor and veiled threats about how I'd never work in this town again once they were done with me. "Hey, kid." I looked up. Joe was standing in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. He didn't say anything about the newspapers. He didn't ask if I was crazy. He just handed me a heavy ceramic mug filled with the good coffee, the stuff he kept in the back for himself. "Don't let 'em grind you down," Joe said, his voice like gravel. "I've seen a lot of people walk through that front door. The ones in the fancy suits, they're usually the ones with the most to hide. You're the realest thing in this zip code, Daphne." "Thanks, Joe," I whispered, the warmth of the mug seeping into my fingers. I needed that. "Just get back in here in 5. Table 6 wants more sourdough." When I finally got home that night, Marcus Thorne was waiting in the hallway. He looked even more disheveled than usual, his tie lopsided and a smudge of ink on his cheek, but his eyes were bright, lethal even. "I found it," he said, skipping the greeting as I unlocked the door. "Found what?" I let him in, and he immediately spread several folders across my small kitchen table. "The reason they're so desperate. I did a deep dive into your father's Caldwell International holdings. It's a ghost ship, Daphne. He's been moving money from one shell company to another to pay off interest on massive private loans. It's basically a high society Ponzi scheme." I leaned over the table, my heart racing. "How much do they owe?" "To the banks? About $3 million. To the private investors who don't care about legal paperwork? Probably double that," Marcus said, tapping a finger on a bank statement. "They aren't just broke, they're hunted. They need Nana Rose's $15 million to pay off the sharks before they lose the house, the cars, and their reputation." I sat down, the weight of it hitting me. My parents weren't just being mean, they were trying to steal my life to save their own. They were willing to have me declared mentally incompetent, to strip away my future, just to keep their country club memberships. "And tomorrow?" I asked. "Is the judge going to listen?" "Judge Whitaker is old school," Marcus warned. "He likes order. He likes tradition. On paper, your parents look like the victims, the grieving mother and father trying to help their wayward daughter. On paper, you look like a girl who's lost her way." He reached out, placing a hand over mine. "Tomorrow is going to be ugly, Daphne. Preston Vane is going to say things about you that will make you want to scream. He's going to bring up every mistake you made as a teenager. He's going to make this apartment look like a dungeon and your job look like a cry for help." I looked around my studio. It was small, yes. The wallpaper was peeling in the corner, and the radiator hissed like an angry snake. But I had paid for every inch of it myself. "Let him," I said, my voice steady. "Let him say whatever he wants." "Are you ready to show your hand?" Marcus asked. I looked at my laptop, the small blue light of the power button blinking in the dark. "I'm ready to do more than that," I said. "I'm ready to end the Caldwell legacy." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window and watched the rain turn to mist. I thought about Nana Rose. She had left me that money because she knew I was the only one who wouldn't be corrupted by it. She knew I understood the value of $1 because I'd earned it 1 nickel at a time. I took a long shower, washing the smell of the diner out of my hair for what felt like the last time. Tomorrow, the broke waitress was going to court. But I wasn't going as a victim. I was going as the reckoning.
The Philadelphia County Courthouse is a monument to intimidation. It's a place of soaring marble columns, echoing hallways, and the heavy metallic scent of justice that's been polished until it's cold. As Marcus and I walked through the double oak doors of Courtroom 4B, the air felt 10 degrees cooler. I had traded my stained apron for a simple navy blue sheath dress. It was modest, clean, and the only expensive thing I'd bought in years. My blonde hair was pulled back into a tight, professional bun. I didn't want to look like a millionaire, but I refused to look like the broken girl they had painted in the tabloids. My parents were already there, seated at the front. Victoria looked like she was attending a funeral, dressed in head-to-toe black lace, dabbing a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. Charles sat beside her, his arms crossed, looking at his gold watch as if this entire proceeding was a minor inconvenience in his busy schedule. Preston Vane stood by their side, whispering into my father's ear. When he saw me, a predatory smile flickered across his face. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Judge Whittaker entered. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. Silver hair, deep-set eyes, and a mouth that looked like it hadn't smiled since the 70s. He settled into his bench and looked down at us through thick spectacles. "We are here for the matter of the Caldwell estate and the petition for involuntary conservatorship over Daphne Caldwell," Whittaker said, his voice a dry rasp. "Mr. Vane, you have the floor." Preston Vane stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a flourish. "Your Honor, this is a tragic case of a young woman with every advantage who has suffered a profound psychological collapse. Daphne Caldwell comes from a lineage of excellence, yet she has chosen to live in conditions that can only be described as squalid. She works a menial job for wages that barely cover her subsistence." He gestured toward a projector screen. A photo of my studio apartment, the one he'd taken illegally, flashed up. It looked small, cluttered with my computer equipment and stacks of books. "This is not the home of a rational heiress, Your Honor. This is a nest, a hideout," Vane continued, his voice dripping with mock pity. "She counts pennies in a diner, while a $15 million trust sits waiting. She refuses to speak to her parents. She has abandoned her social standing. We aren't here to steal her money, we are here to save her from herself before she ends up on the street." I felt the heat rising in my neck. I looked at my parents. My mother wouldn't meet my gaze, but my father was staring straight ahead, a smug, satisfied set to his jaw. He thought he was winning. "The evidence is clear," Vane said, turning to look directly at me. "Daphne Caldwell is financially illiterate. She is incapable of discerning value. She is, for all intents and purposes, a child playing at being a waitress. We ask that the court grant full conservatorship to Charles and Victoria Caldwell to protect the family legacy." The room was silent. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Every eye in the gallery was on me, waiting for the crazy girl to melt down. Marcus Thorne leaned over and whispered, "Let him finish his dance. The higher they jump, the harder they hit the floor." I took a deep breath, the scent of old wood and floor wax filling my lungs. I looked at the judge. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thorne," Whittaker prompted, "do you have a response, or should I start signing the orders?" Marcus stood up slowly. He didn't have Vane's polish, his suit was a bit rumpled, and he fumbled with a USB drive. "Just a few points of clarification, Your Honor, if it pleases the court."
Marcus didn't start with the millions. He started with a single sheet of paper, my employment record from the diner. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice surprisingly resonant for such a small man, "Mr. Vane has spent a lot of time talking about what my client isn't. He says she isn't a socialite. He says she isn't rational. He says her job as a waitress is proof of a mental breakdown." He walked toward the gallery, stopping right in front of my parents. Charles didn't even look at him. He was busy buffing his fingernails against his blazer. "Daphne Caldwell hasn't asked for a dime from her parents since she was 19 years old," Marcus said, turning back to the judge. "While her peers were spending their parents' dividends on European summers, Daphne was learning the value of labor. She was learning how to manage people, how to multitask under extreme pressure, and most importantly, how to save." Preston Vane let out a sharp, theatrical laugh. "Save?
Your Honor, she makes $2.13 an hour plus tips. You can't save your way to $15 million on a diet of pancakes and coffee. It's mathematically impossible. Her saving is just another symptom of her delusion. My mother giggled behind her hand, a delicate, rehearsed sound that made my skin crawl. My father joined in, a low, rumbling chuckle that filled the quiet courtroom. "She's just a broke waitress, Your Honor," my father called out from his seat, ignoring the bailiff's warning look. "She's been playing house in a slum for years. Let's stop the charade." Judge Whittaker banged his gavel, his eyes flashing. "Mr. Caldwell, you will remain silent or you will be removed. Mr. Thorne, get to the point. Hard work is admirable, but we are here to discuss financial competency regarding a massive estate." Marcus nodded, his expression remaining perfectly calm. "The point, Your Honor, is that my client didn't just save her nickels, she invested them." "Invested what?" Vane sneered, leaning against the mahogany table. "The change people left on the table for her? What did she buy, Your Honor? A few shares of a soda company? Maybe some penny stocks?" "Actually," Marcus said, clicking his remote, "she built an algorithm. She founded a private investment firm, and she did it all while scrubbing tables, as you so eloquently put it." The screen behind the judge flickered. A logo appeared, a minimalist geometric DC inside a circle, DC Ventures. I saw my father's posture change. He sat up straighter, his brow furrowing. He knew that name. Every person in the Philadelphia financial sector knew that name. DC Ventures had been the ghost of the market for the last 3 years, making surgical, high-profit moves that left the big banks scrambling to keep up. "What is this?" my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "This," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, "is the financial history of the woman you claim cannot manage a piggy bank. Your Honor, we would like to submit Exhibit G, the certified audited holdings of DC Ventures, of which Daphne Caldwell is the sole founder and 100% owner." Marcus handed a thick, leather-bound folder to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the rustle of paper as Judge Whittaker began to flip through the pages. I watched his eyes. They moved slowly at first, then faster. Then he stopped. He pushed his glasses up his nose and stared at a single page for what felt like an eternity. He looked at me, then back at the papers, then over at my parents. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his voice unusually quiet, "you claimed Miss Caldwell was unfit to manage $15 million? "Yes, Your Honor," Vane said, though his confidence was clearly flickering. "As the evidence of her lifestyle shows—" "Mr. Vane," Whittaker interrupted, his voice growing cold. "According to these certified bank records, Miss Caldwell currently has a personal liquidity and asset valuation totaling over $42 million. The silence in the room didn't just fall, it shattered. My mother's designer handbag slipped from her lap, hitting the marble floor with a heavy thud. My father's face went from smug to a sickly pale gray. He looked like he had just watched his own ghost walk into the room. "42?" Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Million?" I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of their judgment. I felt the weight of my own power.
The silence in the courtroom was so thick I could hear the frantic ticking of the clock on the back wall. It sounded like a countdown. My father's mouth hung open, his lips moving wordlessly like a fish out of water. Victoria was staring at me as if I had suddenly grown wings and flown to the ceiling. 42 million. Judge Whittaker repeated, the number echoing off the marble walls. He looked over the bench, his gaze landing heavily on my parents. "Mr. Vane, you mentioned your clients were concerned about Miss Caldwell's financial illiteracy.
It seems to me she has outperformed the entire Caldwell family combined for the last 3 fiscal years. Preston Vane was sweating. I could see the moisture glistening on his forehead, ruining his perfect grooming. Your Honor, this must be a mistake, or perhaps it's proof of the very instability we're talking about. A waitress with $40 million? It's suspicious. It's called compounding interest and market foresight, Preston, I said, my voice cutting through his panic. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I suggest you look up the word innovation. It's what people do when they aren't living off their grandparents' ghosts. Quiet, Daphne, my father barked, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He turned to the judge, a desperate, oily smile plastered on his face. Your Honor, if this is true, well, it only proves we were right to be concerned. Such a large sum of money in the hands of someone living in a hovel? She's clearly not using it. She's hoarding. It's a sign of a disordered mind. He was reaching for straws, and he was drowning. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, adjusting his lopsided tie. Actually, Your Honor, since we are on the topic of disordered finances and hoarding, I think it's only fair we look at the other side of this petition. If the court is to decide who is fit to manage a trust, we should examine the fitness of the proposed conservators. My father froze. His eyes darted to the exit. What is the meaning of this? Victoria shrilled, her voice cracking. Our finances are private. We are the Caldwells. Not for long, Marcus said, his voice as cold as a winter morning. He handed a second set of folders to the bailiff. These are the public lien records and private debt audits for Charles and Victoria Caldwell. Your Honor, the Caldwell legacy is currently $3 million in the red with major banks. Furthermore, they are being investigated for moving funds through offshore shell companies to avoid a total foreclosure on their primary residence. The judge's face went from stern to disgusted. He flipped through the new documents. It appears, Your Honor, the only unfit individuals in this room are the ones sitting at the petitioner's table. Mr. Vane, did you know your clients were essentially bankrupt when you filed this motion for competency? Preston Vane looked at his parents, then at the judge, then at his briefcase. He didn't say a word. He knew his reputation was burning down in real time. This wasn't a petition for protection, Marcus thundered, finally dropping the unassuming act. This was a heist. They tried to use the court to kidnap their daughter's future to pay off their own gambling debts and bad investments. They wanted to declare her insane because she was the only one in the family who actually knew how to work. My mother started to sob, not the delicate silk handkerchief sob before, but a raw, ugly sound of pure terror. My father just sank into his chair, looking small. The lion of the country club had been declawed in front of a court record. Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel. The sound was like a gunshot. I have heard enough, he stated. This court finds the petition for conservatorship not only without merit, but moreover it is a malicious abuse of the legal system. The petition is dismissed with prejudice. He leaned over the bench, staring directly at my father. Mr. Caldwell, I am referring your financial records to the district attorney's office for an investigation into your shell company activities. And as for the inheritance of Rose Caldwell, he looked at me and allowed the smallest, almost invisible smile to touch his lips. It belongs to the waitress.
The air outside the courthouse felt different. The rain had stopped, leaving the city of Philadelphia sparkling under a hesitant sun. The smell of wet asphalt was sharp and clean, cutting through the stagnant scent of old paper and desperation that had filled the courtroom. I stood on the top step, breathing it in. For the first time in nearly a decade, I didn't feel like I was running. I wasn't hiding from a name or a legacy. I was just Daphne! Daphne, wait! The voice was thin and frantic. I turned to see my parents scurrying down the hallway toward the exit. They looked 10 years older than they had an hour ago. My mother's mascara was ruined, leaving dark streaks down her face, and my father's expensive charcoal suit seemed to hang off his slumped shoulders. As they reached the sidewalk, they were instantly swarmed, not by paparazzi, but by 3 men in poorly fitted suits holding clipboards, the debt collectors Marcus had mentioned. "Mr. Caldwell, we have a formal notice regarding the foreclosure on the Hamptons property," one shouted. "Charles, please," Victoria cried, clutching his arm as she looked at me. "Daphne, tell them you'll help. You have $42 million. What is $3 million to you? It's a rounding error." My father pushed past a collector and grabbed the marble railing to steady himself. He looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked greed. "Daphne, listen to me. We're family. We did what we did because we were stressed. We can fix this. With your capital and my connections, the Caldwell name could be bigger than ever." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the man who called me nothing in a greasy diner. I saw the woman who laughed at the idea of me being able to count. "Connections?" I asked softly. "The only connection you have left, Charles, is with the district attorney. And as for family, a family doesn't try to lock their daughter in a mental ward to steal her inheritance." "You can't just leave us like this," Victoria wailed, her voice drawing stares from passers-by. "We're your parents. We gave you everything." "No," I said, reaching into the pocket of my navy blazer. I felt my fingers brush against something small and crumpled. I pulled it out. It was a $5 bill, stained with a faint ring of coffee, the last tip I'd earned from Old Man Miller before the trial began. I stepped forward and pressed the bill into my father's trembling hand. "Here," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Consider this a tip for the performance you gave in there. Manage it wisely, Dad. It's more than you've actually earned in years." I didn't wait for the explosion. I didn't stay to watch the collectors close in. I walked down the steps, my heels clicking a rhythmic victory march against the stone. I didn't call a limo. I didn't go to a 5-star hotel. I caught the 4:02 bus. When I walked into Penny's plate, the lunch rush was just ending. The bell chimed, and the familiar smell of grease and sourdough wrapped around me like a hug. Joe was at the counter, his brow furrowed as he looked at a past due notice from the electric company. "Hey, kid, you're late for your shift, and you're dressed like you're going to a funeral." "In a way, I was," I said, sliding onto a stool. Joe looked up, his eyes softening as he saw my face. "The judge? Did he dismissed it, Joe. All of it." Joe let out a breath that sounded like a steam whistle. "Thank God. I was worried I'd find another waitress who actually knows how to keep the salt shakers full." "Actually, Joe," I reached into my bag and pulled out a certified check I'd had Marcus prepare that morning. I slid it across the counter. Joe picked up the check. His eyes went wide. "Daphne, this is enough to buy the whole block. What is this?" "I'm buying the diner, Joe. Not to change it, but to fix it. New roof, new equipment, and a full healthcare plan for you and the girls on the morning shift. I want you to run it. I want to be the silent partner who actually knows how to clean the grill." Joe's hands shook as he looked at the check. "Why?" "Because you were the only one who didn't care about my bank balance." I stood up and took off my navy blazer, revealing the simple white blouse underneath. I grabbed a clean apron from the hook behind the counter and tied it around my waist. "What are you doing?" Joe asked, half laughing, half crying. "You're a millionaire, Daphne. You don't have to do this."
I grabbed a coffee pot and headed toward table 4, where a tired-looking construction worker was just sitting down. "I know I don't have to," I said, looking back at Joe with a smile that reached my eyes. I just poured the coffee, the steam rising in the afternoon light. My life was no longer a secret, and my fortune was no longer a burden. I was Daphne Caldwell, a tech genius, an heiress, and a damn good waitress. And for the first time in my life, the balance was exactly where it needed to be.